Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons, Sarah Turner, Alexander Lashley and Avery. For as little as $3, you can gain access to Patreon-only episodes, as well as access to our Discord server, where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. This week, psychotherapist Harriet, Fraad, and substance abuse counsellor Ikoi Hero are joined by YouTube creator T1J, who recently created a video essay asking the question, why aren't there more black socialists?
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Other than asking just that question straight out and, asking you to repeat your whole video, I was thinking, was the video born out of your own experiences with the DSA or your friends' experiences?
Over just my overall experiences. I don't have like a ton of like direct experience with like the DSA specifically or that, but just over time interacting with people in the community and online and stuff, and just thinking about the things that I've heard or the conversations that I have, and I guess that's kind of where I got it from. Amalgamation of all the things all the discussions I've had.
Well, it's interesting to me because the history has been that the Communist Party was the first to really publicly, besides Du Bois and the NAACP, to publicly rally support for some kind of racial justice in this country. And one of the earliest amazing things, which was written about by Adolph Reed, was the Tenant Farmers Association of black and white farmers with the Communist Party organized in the South and together to demand rights for all of them. And the Socialist Party was a huge party in the United States and was not the party of the college educated. It was a party of people who labor for a living. And it was terribly crushed during and after World War I. And so that tradition, as well as the socialist and communist traditions in the 1930s, were crushed by the McCarthy period. And so I think one of the things that's happened to kind of skew socialist awareness in the United States is that people rediscovered that in college. And people who are less privileged have less access to college and therefore didn't know about that tradition because labor history is not taught and racial history is not taught in America. I mean, I have a doctorate and a postdoctorate, never heard of the stuff except out of my own research. And so I think that what's happening is that the left is only rediscovering its own history, including the histories of Black liberation that have to be included.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think the next step then is to figure out how to sort of redeploy that message.
Yes.
To the people. And I guess that was kind of the essence of the video is that message like being sent in the way that, or is it being sent at all, or is it being sent in an effective way?
Not very effective. We don't have a unified socialist movement. Martin Luther King, in his speech to the longshoremen, the dock workers in California, said he thought the best path to racial and economic justice was unions, fighting together for a better world for the people who do the work. And I am certainly hoping that the resurgence of the labor movement will be exactly that. And I think Chris Smalls stands for that at the Amazon Labor Union, that together we need each other to win. Nobody's going to win alone. It's the people at the bottom who are the majority and need each other, and we better embrace one another because otherwise that whole history is forgotten.
Well, it's interesting that you bring the history into it, because that was one of the stats or one of the talking points early on in the video, was that, the DSA has over 100,000 members, but a huge part of that membership is white millennials, right? So some of that history is not present, and
it isn't. And they're not workers in the same way.
Something that's kind of telling. This is a few years ago, but the DSA made a statement on the Nazi violence in Charlottesville, and one of the things that they said is, we believe that the terror unleashed on our comrades can be defeated. We also believe that the wider system of racist oppression can be defeated, but only with the ending of the capitalist system which birthed it. And that is sort of the rub of this issue, and the video you made is you said it brilliantly, like, solving racial oppression is not a side quest,
right?
And that seems to be the source of tensions. Like, if the DSA is predominantly white, and the belief is, if we defeat capitalism, then there won't be racism, that you basically completely sort of unpack that, and you just say, look, that's not how it's going to work. But you make this really interesting point that for some people, capitalism looks like the only thing that works. And I thought that was really interestingly illustrated recently, where Jay-Z had claimed that sort of capitalist was a derogatory term invented to bring down the Black community.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. And I mean, I think that's a kind of a weird thing for Jay-Z to say, but
yeah,
I understand what he's like. From my perspective, it's hard for me to tell someone like Jay-Z, like, you shouldn't have done what you did. You shouldn't have brought yourself out of poverty. You shouldn't have, made a better life for yourself. Like, it's hard for me to say that to someone like Jay-Z. So I kind of understand why he is defensive when people are attacking him for, being rich or whatever.
Well, of course, it's a mistake to attack people because they have money, rather than what do they do in their lives to bring justice to everyone, racial, economic justice. And one of the things that I think has to be emphasized is capitalists use any arbitrary divisions between people, race, gender, sex, color, to divide the working class. And we need each other, and we're all in it together, and we better proceed. What the capitalist system does, is it does send out the carrot that if you're a good capitalist and you're smart enough, as if all these other things didn't matter, you can make it if you really try. That's part of the mythology of the capitalist system. And if you don't make it, it's because there's something wrong with you personally. That individualist message. And I think a lot of people of all colors voted for Obama because they felt that because he was a brown person, he would bring justice, whereas African Americans lost more wealth during his administration than in the previous 50 years, because he didn't save the subprime mortgage holders, he saved the banks with no strings attached. And the fact that he was brown didn't determine who he saved, but the fact that he was wedded to the top did. So, those lessons have to be learned, I think.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is sort of, there's a couple of different directions here. You reference Cornel West making the point that racism itself predates capitalism. And so, yes, whilst the capitalists might do some sort of divide and conquer thing, that what's actually happening here, or why there is a predominantly white mass in the DSA membership, is clearly not addressing racism, and that racism is on equal footing in terms of solving social problems. And it was really interesting, actually. I watched your reaction video because Hassan reacted to your video. Mm-hmm. And there was a great bit in there where he was dismissing identity politics stuff, as has happened various conversations on this podcast, that, like The worst side of it is just that it creates even further division, like no one can get on. But the best part of it, he called it pandering, but you made a really good point about the benefits of that. I wondered if you sort of wanted to maybe reiterate some of that.
Sometimes it's hard to think about because to me it seems pretty obvious that sort of political policy and political strategy like must be thought about with the consideration that different groups of people have different needs. Mm-hmm. And the messaging that I hear a lot from socialists is that, or at least it sounds like, people will acknowledge that, but it still sounds like, yeah, but we can kind of solve all that through this one size fits all class analysis, which is, that's kind of like what I was struggling with in the video. And it's true. Like one of the things that Hassan brought up was how identity politics is kind of used by, particularly the Democrats to, he used the word pander, and they kind of, pay lip service to these things while not really doing a whole lot about it. But even that being said, it's still, I would still say it's necessary to think about not just race, but also, gender, sexuality, all these other things, and think about how we can deal with those issues on their own when it's necessary to do so.
Well, I do think if you're going to have ever any success in this country, it will be because the mass of people who share the same concerns get together. And identity politics, which has certain validity, it certainly does, also was introduced by the CIA and FBI, in the 1960s, where they changed civil rights to Black power and women's liberation to a gender-only liberation instead of what we had at the beginning as a sort of founding mother. I can testify that if we stand up as united women of all colors, we've been at the bottom, and Black women have been at the very bottom. However, if we stand up, everybody will come with us. Now, that was wrong, and we didn't even look at the money that was coming in Ms. Magazine, which had no ads, which was, of course, the CIA. And it wasn't until that book came out, The Great Wurlitzer, that it was documented that they did that to dismember a class-divided, united movement of everyone, which should be, I think, the Chilean movement, the Colombian movement, even the movement recently for Mélenchon in France, are successful because they respected each group and yet acknowledged that we need each other and we need to fight together. Class being very important for all of us, but all the other aspects needing to be included. And America's left is very backward. Once the McCarthy era decimated the left in the United States, we're just beginning to recover. It only began to recover in 2011 with the Occupy movement coming up with the 1%, 99% analysis and reintroducing class on a mass level. And so it's very primitive.
One of our patrons, El, made the point that, well, certainly for him, he feels like class and race can't be separated, that your race is a class. I mean, are there any sort of reactions to that as an idea? Or
I mean, I think it's obviously true that race and class intersect greatly. But I don't want to sound like weird or anything, because I mean, there's clearly a lot of Black socialists out there, but it's hard for me to imagine someone who has experienced racism to believe that racism only occurs as a function of class, because it's just not.
It's not true.
It's just not true. And that's just kind of the analysis I hear a lot. It's going back to the Cornel West thing and other stuff like that. I mean, and I've heard from some people that it sounds don't know, like cynical or pessimistic or something, but it's just like a function of human beings existing together. Like this idea that, and I like earlier when you said like, some people say when you get rid of capitalism, you'll also get rid of racism. And you kind of like chuckled when you say that, but like, that's a real thing that people say all the time. Like people believe, or at least they believe it will be greatly diminished, or there'll be no incentive for racism. And I just feel like that's just not how human beings are in a society, like when different types of people come together.
That's true. You would have to fight all arbitrary divisions between people, whether it's sexism or racism or anti-sexual choice that of course, it's a psychological mechanism to step a little higher by stepping on someone else's head. And that has to be addressed. Race has been used, Black people have been used as shock absorbers so that capitalism's failures, they're the last hired, the first fired, and it's assumed that that's because there's something wrong with them. Now that the mass of the working class in the United States is in big trouble, racism is contested on a high level, and it should be, because these divisions are the opposite of what people need, and human beings wouldn't have survived if we had those divisions. Communism had to be because resources were scarce and people had to share them. That's just the way we survived as humans. And so the idea that we have to be hierarchical on the basis of arbitrary ideas, and it also should be exposed that racism was introduced and reinforced when you wanted to get people to work for free, to make money for you. Before that, from the very beginning, class discrimination was huge, because the majority of people who came here as bondspeople. Somebody paid for their way over, and then they had to work for free for at least 7 years without pay. And if they ran away, they were caught, and they had a greater amount of service, and they had no rights. Now that was over after the years that they served. And they were white people, but they were in temporary slavery. And the majority of women who were bondswomen were married for 7 years, where they had to produce this guy's children as well as do all this other work. But that kind of issue is not part of our history, just like labor history isn't taught, and the history of Black resistance isn't taught. Or most Americans don't know that 55 million Native Americans were slaughtered. It's just there is this determined effort to keep us from knowing where we came from, and that we came up in a class striated society, and that after the Constitution was written, 6% of Americans could vote. You had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to have property. Whoa, 6%.
Yeah, and I think the sort of socialist focus on class, however right on it is, I mean, this might be a direct quote, but I have it in big letters on my notepad here. It might be from a direct quote from your video. Marginalized groups are being told their concerns aren't real or don't matter. And that is obviously part of the problem. Without going down the rabbit hole here, Ikoi, sorry, it was your turn to speak. The microphone definitely works.
Now it works.
Yeah.
Hello. Sorry. Nice to meet you. I think ultimately one of the issues is that, like, whether it's class or race, it's always kind of like, treated as a really convenient moving goalpost against against the concerns that people are bringing up.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't, for all the talk about class, I don't think that a lot of, everything from like center all the way to the left really address class in itself well.
Exactly.
And I don't think they also raise issues that are going on within race well, because it's also like even within like the Asian American community or the African American community, the Hispanic community. I mean, there is each community is really diverse as well.
And class diverse.
And class diverse as well, so depending on where people are coming from, there is a really often said quip that people love to say that almost rarely ever gets, acted on. When people say, like, you have to meet people where they're at, right? People love to say that. It's almost never done.
Of course.
Right.
Because I know, like, a lot of white people that have, like, gone into the DSA and have felt like, oh, these groups don't necessarily address, some of my most pressing needs. Also same for, like, various minorities. One of the things that, like, somebody that I knew said about joining a lot of left organizations have been, it's like, I already get all the manager bullshit at work, and I really don't want to have to deal with it outside of work.
What is the manager bullshit?
Right. Well, where it's kind of like this very, top down, like there's like, the influential members of any given group dictating to everyone else kind of feeling.
Yeah, these hierarchies.
Right. And so and ultimately, if these groups aren't addressing some of your most pressing needs, then, like, why would I do this?
Yeah. And we don't have, the kind of powerful labor-oriented socialist movement that America had before it was crushed at first in World War I and then again in the McCarthy period. It's more in Europe. In France, they recently have a united left, which is the biggest group in their parliament. And that's why they have really they raised minimum wage 15% across the board, an additional 10% for civic workers who are mainly people of color. We don't have a powerful labor movement. In Europe, although to get Marshall Plan money, you had to throw the communists out of the university, but then they joined the unions instead. And because the Communist Party was the spearhead of the resistance to the Nazis, they couldn't quite crush it the way they did here. But we should remember, class only relates to who produces the goods and services and who appropriates them and who distributes them and to their own profit. And that has to be changed, but that doesn't necessarily address racial bias or sexual bias or of any kind. Those things also have to be addressed because they're arbitrary, cruel, and divisive divisions between people. And that would have to be part of any kind of mass movement. And part of people's anger at DSA is it's not rooted in a big labor movement. Because now we have a left labor movement with people like Chris Smalls and the Amazon labor unions. But the AFL-CIO sold out in anti-communism throughout all the leftists and the socialists and the communists in the 30s and is very much a vehicle of the State Department, with some exceptions like the Postal Workers Union or Sarah Nelson of the flight attendants. That's why Chris Small's union, Amazon Labor Union, is not in the AFL. We really are very backward on these things in the United States and on a united class movement.
I mean, at its most simplest, it's very difficult. A bunch of white people trying to convince a bunch of black people to, hey, let's all work together, given the history. Mm-hmm. And as you said, colorblind economic solidarity isn't going to happen.
Yeah, it might. I mean, it may very well be true that solving the economic problems will require a lot of people believe that there will be no class solidarity if there's not a pledge or an action towards solving some of these identity issues like racism. And those kinds of things might very well be true, my video is not really meant to argue against whether that kind of thing is true, but the question is, how are you, like, it's just like, why aren't there more Black? So like, how are you going to adjust your messaging or like to appeal to Black people or any group? Because I think a lot of people believe that by focusing on this class analysis that they are in effect dealing with racism, or that they will deal with racism because by solving certain class issues, then that will, naturally result in better conditions for these other groups. And again, that very well might be true, but the question I was trying to deal with is, how is that going to convince these people to align with you? And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, and to that sort of line of thought, I mean, there's this, in one of your other videos, you're talking about white saviors and the racial reconciliation fantasy, movies that fix issues in a few hours in a fantasy land, opposed to white people doing anything about it in real life. And it is that sort of feeds into all that sort of stuff, because we were having a discussion a couple of days ago about this idea of like, if part of the problem is sort of perception or messaging with some of this stuff that essentially white people have towards other groups, then what is the sort of Rubik's Cube puzzle to actually appeal to other people? And so I think there's some element of fear. I think we were talking about this idea of staying in your lane.
I think that I think the problem with that is the socialists, I don't claim to be an expert on all of the socialist ideas, but it seems like socialists need this widespread solidarity in order to achieve their goals. So it seems like staying in your lane is not an option if this is to succeed. And I think that's, going back to like the Jay-Z thing, I think that's why a lot of Black people might be a little hesitant, because at least in theory, you're kind of put in this kind of bad situation, you're marginalized in society, and you just kind of work through the cracks on your own in your community and try to figure something out for your life. And it doesn't really require this sort of widespread movement. And I think that's kind of like what it feels like the only option is for a lot of people. So I think that's kind of the issue with this whole staying in your lane kind of thing. Like you're going to have to step outside of the club and reach out to other people in some way.
The whole staying in your lane thing is also kind of a pessimism, right? That like you can't fully understand. I mean, ultimately we can't fully understand ourselves, much less, other people. But at the same time, it's a matter of sincere interest, right? A lot of staying in your lane, how it plays out actually in social settings is a dismissal rather than like, oh, I need to actually like listen to you and hear your needs and hear your concerns of what you're going through. Take those concerns seriously, because that's in therapy spaces, that's probably one of the biggest major complaints that people talk about, in complaints about therapists, right? Is that, they're in this situation of pretty dire need, and they feel like the therapists are constantly dismissing their need and not addressing it.
Right.
Right. That like, if you look at, any complaints within those spaces, that's generally one of the biggest complaints that happen over and over and over again. And I think it happens in those spaces because it's also endemic in society, right? That a lot of people have this kind of like contradiction of, I know what's good for you, along with, I don't really want to really understand you.
Right. And so what, the DSA falls under the category of I know what's good for you, but
Well,
I don't listen to you. That kind of thing.
And I don't think that, I don't necessarily want to like implicate the DSA or anything. I think it's just like issues in society in general. But it's not just a DSA thing, so I'm not here to like crap on, DSA or any socialist group or any group for that matter. But that is one of the differences between like some of, I have friends that work in like really, community-based level organizations, and that's some of the complaints that they have about some of the other organizations is like, I am representing, my community's needs in a certain way that's not being heard elsewhere. That's not being addressed elsewhere.
I wonder though, is there a sort of a flip side to all of this stuff? Okay, you don't stay in your lane, you reach out, you try and build a bridge. Does it ever go too far? Are there sort of like sort of socialist white saviors? Is there is there sort of white people being cringe, that kind of thing? Does have you experienced that? Does that happen?
In my experience, it's just kind of a difference of perspective, maybe, because I think probably most DSA members and most socialists in general would probably dispute the idea that they're saying that they know what's best for Black people or for anyone else, or in that sort of derisive way. Mm-hmm. But I just think it's sort of a difference in perspective of what needs to be done, and that's why I focused sort of on the messaging, which may be kind of frustrating for people when you say, well, maybe what you're saying is correct, you're just saying it wrong, which is not exactly what I'm saying, but I do think the way that it comes off could be a problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of the issues that happen, for example, with like my friend, I have a friend that works in Baltimore, and a lot of times between like, different groups kind of trying to figure out, their agenda, so to speak, right? There is the sense of, it always kind of comes into this sense of like, rather than be like, okay, like on areas we agree, we'll cooperate and let you guys lead. It's more of like, you need to follow our program is kind of the fight that often ends up happening. Because one of the things is that seems to happen frequently is just, this sense of like, hey, like, you guys have been working on this, so you should keep working on what you guys are doing and we'll support you where you feel is, you would like our help. Because, one of the things that kind of always gets in the way is kind of looking towards a more complete agreement rather than like, what, there are different ways to address this one issue, and, whatever you guys are doing to address that issue within your community, we're going to let you do that.
We're going to let you.
Or we're going to like, I mean, and that goes for like any group towards other groups. Like, yeah, like, you guys should keep doing what you're doing. And instead it's kind of like this bickering of no, like you should do it our way.
Yeah, but this is a sort of a central point that you make in, I think the reaction video. You say, people haven't got time to wait around for your revolution.
I think with Black people too, and it's hard to explain and maybe hard to understand, but I do think that a lot of Black people feel a little bit almost like separate from, especially white America, and it's challenging to tell Black people, hey, we need you to come and, join our big movement for our country, and we're going to make everything better. And I feel like a lot of Black, I mean, it could be wrong. I think a lot of Black people might be like, yeah, but I mean, we need to figure out what we're going to do because we've had a go of it. And you're saying we need to come join you, but, we're not sure what's going to work for us as a group. And, not to say that, Black people, are a monolith or, all are trying to figure out things in the same way. But I do feel that way. I do think that a lot of Black people feel that way.
I think the disappointing thing from conversations we've had on this podcast with various people or whatever, various discussions, is this idea of people do turn up to some kind of organizing hopeful and quickly are turned off the whole thing because they find it to be, I guess what you said earlier, Ikoi, as well, just that it's like work, another version of work, management, etc.
Right. Well, it's work where people don't feel empowered, right? It's work where people aren't feeling like their needs are being addressed. That's different. That's I think what people are talking about with this kind of like managerial thing is ultimately that work is often a place where your needs aren't addressed, right? It's a very top down, like you are here to, do this thing regardless of whether you like it or not, or whether it's beneficial for you or not, or it could even be like harmful to you. In this day and age, with very little protections, but you have to do it because you have to pay rent and survive. That's kind of like the American workplace. If you're working, say, like in a social service sector, if you're putting in 20, 30 hours of unpaid labor, well, screw you. You still have to pay your rent ultimately. So you have to put up with these conditions, or, you can try and find better conditions. Good luck, wink, wink. So when you're kind of living under those conditions in general, you want to, if you're going to spend your outside hours of trying to survive doing something, you do want a space where you at least feel like, I'm working towards my needs being addressed.
I was just going to make the comment that, and I discuss it in my videos, where I didn't want to, I could have a discussion about like socialism broadly, but I didn't want to come off as like, my video wasn't really supposed to be like a critique of socialism. Is just kind of like what is the disconnect? It basically is kind of what I was asking. And but like ultimately I think it's just about improving people's lives. That's kind of the main thing that I care about. And I'm always interested in having discussions about that, no matter what angle you're coming at it from. And like, for example, in the video, I talk about Bernie Sanders a lot, and I actually got a lot of comments because a lot of people said that it sounded like I was just bashing Bernie Sanders, but I actually supported Bernie Sanders. And that's just kind of an idea of like that, I want to know, like, what can we do? Let's get things done. And,
because you presented that poll as well, like 68% of Black American voters called themselves moderate or conservative. And so, you're right, there is a disconnect. And if that's the sort of voting intention, then, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, or
right. I think there was a book on that. I think it's called Silent Majority. Have you heard of it?
I don't think I've heard of that.
Okay. But I think it deals with that question. And again, I think it's also one of those things where, like you said, the most important thing is to improve the lives of people. And one of the aspects of, I think, trying to improve the lives of people is, not necessarily to draw this hard line of like, are you a socialist or are you not a socialist?
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Right. But, it's like, hey, like, you guys look like you're doing really good work, in whatever group you're doing. And we would like to support you in that. Instead of, you're not a socialist, so, we're going to bash you, right?
Right.
Right.
And I try not to paint with a broad brush, and I think your mentality can be warped depending on where you spend a lot of your time. And, I get into discussions with people on social media all the time, and it can affect what your impression of leftists online. If all you interact with is like Twitter. So I try to remember to,
yeah, it's wild. I mean, but again, it's like the online space is it's a population of, my pet theory, or I can't remember, I read it somewhere. It's ultimately, very distressed people who they don't have any political power. They feel powerless, and online is a place where you can, I don't know, scream into the void and have other people scream back at you, and it feels like maybe you're doing something. But Harriet, did you have any sort of kind of final thoughts? Harriet?
Maybe her mic doesn't work.
Yeah, I think. Yeah,
we're having technical issues galore today. No, and I guess that's what I mean by like meeting people where they're at. It's ultimately like, hey, like, what are your needs? What do you need addressed? What's important to you? And not, because one of the aspects of like working with different communities is also like working within their context, right? With the African American population, it is one where, a lot of people are tied to the church.
Mm-hmm.
And, and if you are necessarily going into that space with, and I say this as an atheist, right? I am a pretty hardcore atheist in many ways, but you have to respect people where you're coming at, and you can't go, your church is bad, your church is conservative, you shouldn't belong to this church, or like, you need to do this or you need to do that. You just need to focus on like, what do we have in common?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that is one of the many great strengths, I think, of your all your YouTube videos. Is I feel like that's exactly what's happening. Is that you are you're not antagonizing anyone, right? You're just talking about various kind of topics, and clearly, it works. Like it's actually kind of sort of a calm oasis in relation to a lot of the stuff that the algorithm drives. I think it's great.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I definitely. That's just kind of the person I am in general. But I do try to. If you're going to talk about something, I feel like you should be measured and fair, and think about it from as many angles as you can. I'd probably get more views if I was more. More sensational and one-sided, but it's just not the way I want to do it.
No, I think that was great. Ikoi, I don't know if you had any sort of final thoughts. Obviously, Harriet has, just the microphone's not working or some weird
Technical
stuff. So I don't know if you've got any sort of final thoughts or final questions or anything.
Again, it's not necessarily a question more than a discussion, but ultimately, one of the major issues that happens in any kind of grouping is this, like, if you're not with us, you're against us mentality, rather than like, this idea of like, hey, how do we bring you more into the fold without necessarily completely, asking for assimilation. Right, because there's this thing of that you see in online spaces of, and online spaces are especially kind of prone to this thing of kind of assuming a lot out of people, assuming the most mendacious intent out of people, or a mendacious background out of people, and kind of acting out on that. Right. That's one of the issues with, the polarization in the online space is just, a lot of times you see two people going at it with each other. And especially like kind of like if you maybe know, some of the more background stories of, one of the speakers, you're just like, oh, like you're assuming a lot out of this person. When you're kind of embroiled into that kind of environment online, you can carry that into your real life spaces as well. So, it's one of those things where sometimes when somebody comes across as like a little bit more conservative, people start assuming all kinds of intent out of this person that may not necessarily be true.
Right.
Right. And rather than kind of like running with your assumptions, you do have to kind of like back up a little bit and go, okay, like, let's hear more about like, how you came to this, where you're coming with this, because one of the big issues with that I see, like, in a lot of the minority spaces is that, there is this desire for home ownership as stability, versus like rent. Just, being like this overwhelming concern, and among the socialists, there can be this like, kind of ignorance of home ownership a little bit that, a lot of people feel within the minority community, and things like that. Right. So it's just like, people be like, oh, you just want to be like, a rotten parasitic landlord, and rather than like, kind of like backing up and go like, okay, like, how are you coming to this? Where are you coming through? And actually having engagement rather than an argument. Mm-hmm. So I think ultimately one of the things that, if you want to expand on your ideas, if you want people to buy into your program, you have to engage people and you have to engage their concerns and needs. There's just no way around it, right? That you can't just argue your way and beat somebody into submission and think that that's how you're going to get. I mean, you might get like the people that agree with you already to agree with you, but are you actually able to build anything on?
Right, and that's the danger of growing up in a culture that has very much a focus on not cooperation, but domination and submission. And so the danger is you then end up recreating that in your own little groups, right? Like you're trying to dominate people to have the right opinions.
Right. I mean, and I think, I think that can be something that like I can say that I've been guilty of that at times, and that I've had to like reroute myself many, many times in my life where I was like, oh, that's totally my bad,
Yeah.
You have to have a certain level. Yeah, you have to have a certain level of humility, but at the end of the day, I can't go around assuming that like people are evil. Systems are evil, but people are trying to work and trying to survive in what is essentially a very brutal world.
In terms of so the online space stuff, it flattens everything, and I think engagement rather than an argument is sort of, I think that actually summarizes sort of beautifully the stuff that you do on YouTube. It's engagement rather than an argument, and I hope people come to your videos not being too hot-headed, or they come in hot-headed and then maybe chill out. I don't know. But in response, actually, to what you were saying with the original intent of making that YouTube video, why aren't there more black socialists? I definitely got the point that you're essentially saying, racism is of equal, if not more important than the class solidarity thing that you're going after. Do you have any sort of, so other than just saying, hey, look, surprise, surprise, you should take racism seriously, in terms of that sort of messaging, is there anything either I'm forgetting from the video that you suggested, or is there anything sort of off the top of your head that you think sort of could work better in terms of bringing people in to the DSA or that kind of thing?
It's hard to say. I mean, I pondered whether it was inherent to the socialist messaging to sort of put racism on kind of like second fiddle to class. Like, is it even possible? And maybe it is. I'm not totally sure, but I don't really know. I mean, like, if you imagine the Democrats, except if they were sincere, like, what would that be like? What would be different? I think that what we've been talking about is the first step, like the engagement, meeting people where they're at, listening to people. I think that's a big thing, because just kind of reiterating what we said. But I do think a lot of what we see is I don't even mean in a nefarious way, but a lot of what we see is people saying, well, how can we get our message out? How can we convince people of what we believe to be the solutions to these problems? When probably what we should be saying is, engaging people. What are your needs? How can we work together to help you with your needs and things like that? So I think that sort of reframing is probably the first step, not so much trying to just throw your ideology on people, but figuring out where people's needs and your ideology kind of intersect.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.